Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
So at the COP26, India was one of the signatories to the Glasgow Pact, which pledges to keep the aim of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels alive. India also made a number of climate targets to, work towards this goal. Today we have with us Mr. Tim Gould, the Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency, to talk about some of these targets. Mr. Gould is also one of the lead authors of the IEA's World Energy Outlook report, and he oversaw the India Energy Outlook for 2021. He was also at the COP26, and maybe he can tell us a bit about his experience. So welcome to The Print.
Thanks very much. It's a huge pleasure.
So one of the first things that I want to ask you is about what made headlines everywhere. India at the COP26 pledged to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2070. The IEA is now working with the Niti Aayog to sort of try to figure out how India should get there. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. What should India's roadmap to 2070 net zero emissions look like? What would India need to do in order to achieve that?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on it. I think the first thing to say is that India's pathway to reach this net zero emissions by 2070 is really, of course, a matter for India to decide. It has to make its own decisions about that pathway. And in doing so, we are very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to contribute to that process from the IEA. We have done a lot of modeling and analytical work, both of other pathways to net zero and also of the potential options for India. And I think, but before getting into the details, let's just get a few things straight about the nature and ambition of this announcement, because for us, this is a hugely significant moment for the global fight against climate change. Because what we're seeing with the Indian announcement is the prospect of a kind of new model of economic development that could avoid the carbon intensive approaches that many countries have pursued in the past. So it's significant for India, but it's hugely significant also for what it implies as a sort of blueprint for other developing economies that are looking to industrialize, urbanize, but in a different way to some of the historical models. So what does that mean in practice? I think it means, many of the things that India is already doing, it would need to do much more of. So if we look at the power sector, for example, there's clearly been a huge investment in recent years in scaling up low emission sources of generation, in building out the grid. We are, hugely impressed with the progress that has been made in recent years in expanding access to electricity. I think we need to just have in mind the magnitude of that achievement. But there's much more to do, and that's why this 2030 target for renewable deployment is incredibly important as well. But I think we need to be very aware that the discussion about India's pathway to net zero, it cannot just be a discussion about what happens to the power sector. In our own modeling, most of the growth that you could envisage in emissions in India in a kind of reference pathway or a pathway based on today's policy settings, most of the growth in emissions would not come from the power sector. It would come from industry. It would come from transport, particularly from freight. So we need to be thinking about also the opportunities to introduce low carbon technologies in some of these much more difficult areas, because we are very conscious of the fact that over the next 2 decades, something like 250 million people will join India's urban population. I mean, that's adding sort of 6 or 7 Mumbais each decade to sort of India's urban infrastructure, and that's a lot of cement, that's a lot of steel, That's a lot of things that are very energy intensive by their nature. So we need to have solutions also in those areas.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit also about the other targets that India had set for 2030, which was, to build 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel energy capacity, and also to fulfill 50% of India's energy requirements, by 2030. There's a little bit of confusion about that, but how feasible is it, and what are some of the challenges that India should expect?
So we're also looking forward to seeing the detail on the second of those areas that you mentioned, because as you say, it's not 100% clear as to the nature of that target. But I think that the one that is crystal clear is the 500 gigawatt target for low emissions generation for renewables. There, I think we would need to see obviously an acceleration in deployment. But I think the starting point is quite encouraging. I mean, India has done a lot in recent years to mobilize investment in clean generation. And it's done that with some models of clean procurement for power that I think are extremely interesting. And we're also looking with a lot of interest at the sort of innovative elements of India's regulatory approach now, where it's not just procuring power, but it's, as you put it, it's looking for guarantees that of power availability. So this ability to package together different forms of renewable generation with storage in some instances. And I think that's an incredibly important development for India's power sector. And because as you add more solar in particular to the generation mix, this need for flexibility becomes a really defining feature of India's power sector development. And there are various ways in which you can manage that need for flexibility. One is with a very robust grid. You have the ability also to provide for some flexible sources of generation. And here I think very important is the ability to run India's coal-fired fleet more flexibly. So not using that so much for baseload power, but also using it to follow the load on the demand side. I think there's a lot that could be done also to make sure that those peaks on the electricity demand side are not too high by making sure that the appliances that are bought in the Indian market are as efficient as possible. And there's a number of policy initiatives underway to introduce more efficient appliances across the Indian market, which I think are very encouraging. But I think the key technology that we need to have in mind in India in particular is the potential for battery storage amongst other storage technologies to play a very important role.
The cost of batteries is still quite high. They're still sort of in development. When can we expect, sort of the prices to come down to make it more affordable?
Yeah, as you say, the costs are relatively high, but they've come down noticeably over the last few years. And we can expect to see continued technology advancements also in that area that makes battery storage much more a much more accessible option for companies and even for households when it comes to managing their energy needs. One issue, though, that we need to be very careful about, and this is an area which we've looked at in some detail at the International Energy Agency, is that as batteries become more important, so you have a whole new set of resource issues that become significant for the energy sector. So we're used to, when we think about energy security, we would traditionally think of oil, we think of natural gas, we think increasingly about electricity. But we also need to be looking very closely at the supply chains for the minerals and metals that are important for battery technologies. So do we have enough lithium supply? Do we have enough cobalt supply? Do we have enough nickel supply to maintain affordable battery technologies? And there, I think, there have been some price increases this year for minerals, as there have been for many other commodities across the world. That's an area which energy policymakers and energy analysts will need to be watching closely.
So I want to ask you more about, the development of technology when it comes to climate change. So the IEA has been a big proponent of net zero by 2050, but also of carbon technology, carbon capture technology. So let me just pull out the statistics. But according to a recent IEA analysis itself, that since between 2010 and 2017, we've managed to capture about 40 million tons of CO2 using carbon capture technology and storage units. But according to the IEA's projections, that number needs to go up to 1.6 billion tons. The IEA continues to be very enthusiastic about carbon capture technology and storage units, but time and again, we've kind of seen that it hasn't worked out. So what is sort of driving the IEA's enthusiasm when it comes to this technology, which, at the end of the day, we don't even know if it will work?
So I think the technology itself, I think is proven. Clearly, there are issues with the business case for investment in that technology. I wouldn't necessarily say that the IEA is enthusiastic for CCUS, but we do see that it answers a number of questions that are otherwise difficult to answer about the way that technologies may evolve in the future. So in our view, there are 4 specific areas in which CCUS could be particularly useful. One is for some industrial processes that will be otherwise very difficult to reduce emissions from, and I think we need to look particularly at cement, but there are others too. Other areas are potentially not in India, but in other countries for the production of hydrogen, because one of the routes to producing low carbon hydrogen is via steam reforming of natural gas, usually with CCUS. Another one is for carbon removal technologies, such as direct air capture or the application of CCUS alongside the bioenergy for power. And then there's another area which I think is also need to have in mind is the potential for some coal-fired power generation facilities to be retrofitted with carbon capture utilization and storage technologies. Now, we haven't seen much of that. We haven't seen much of that successfully, but we need to be having in mind that if you are to bring down emissions from that existing stock of coal-fired generation, we do not believe that it is likely to be feasible to retire large volumes of existing plant very soon. I think that presents all sorts of issues of how to manage the social and economic consequences, and likewise potential consequences for electricity security. So I think we need to have in mind that CCUS, it does come into the picture as a way to reduce the emissions from those existing coal-fired power facilities, which in the case of India and other countries, many of those plants are relatively new.
So at least in the case of India and its previous NDCs, we had pledged to create a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. But a similar issue that is coming up is that we aren't entirely sure how much progress has been made, to what extent, a forest carbon sink can actually deliver. So what are your thoughts on that also? So
as the name of our agency supplies, we're the energy, we're the International Energy Agency. So we really focus on the energy aspects of this equation and how we can manage a transition affordably and reliably towards a net zero emission system. So, we obviously have views on the possibility to, in a sense, import reductions in emissions from outside the energy sector. But we really think that if you're looking at the energy sector, then the first question you need to ask is, what can the energy sector itself deliver? You shouldn't be too reliant on the possibility to, in a sense, deliver emissions reductions from other areas. So we're looking closely at the issue of offsets from outside the energy sector. We've been following closely the negotiations on the sort of Paris rule book, the so-called Article 6 negotiations, which were concluded in Glasgow. But we think it's incumbent upon the energy sector, in a sense, to take responsibility for its own emissions. And we need to think about the solutions that can come from within the sector. So we are naturally quite skeptical of either country or corporate commitments that seem to rely heavily on offsets from outside the energy sector. We believe that there are technologies available to tackle many of those emissions, and we think that's where the focus needs to be.
I also wanted to ask you about the net zero summit that the IEA had done before the COP26. So this was sort of a roadmap that had been laid out by the IEA of how the world can achieve net zero by 2050. Now India has, committed to 2070. China is committed to 2060. So in a way, that deadline has already sort of passed. But I was curious about the roadmap itself, and to what extent did the IEA keep in mind global historical emissions when creating that sort of roadmap? What role did this concept of CBDR, which is common but differentiated responsibilities, to what extent did that play in that document? Because I wasn't able to find it, so I wanted to know about that. India's stance, of course, has always been that it should be on historical emitters to get to net zero before 2050, so that the rest of the developing world can get there later.
It's a very important question, and naturally enough, when we did this net zero roadmap in May of this year, and we released it, that is a global roadmap. And so as a global roadmap, naturally enough, when your aggregates are global, you cannot easily make all of these very important distinctions that you raise about common and differentiated responsibilities. But within that global roadmap, we make it clear that, as you say, it is incumbent upon advanced economies to reach net zero in advance of 2050 if the world is to reach that target by mid-century. There is no new gold standard applicable to everyone. That 2050 is the year that counts, and there needs to be a recognition of both the differentiation of starting points, the differentiation of states of development, responsibilities and capabilities, as you say. So in that global framing, we make it clear that although this is a race to net zero, this is not a typical kind of race. We have to understand that people start in different places and they will finish at different times. And it's incumbent upon those who are, in a sense, in the lead today in terms of their state of development and so on, to reach the finish line first and to help others across the line.
My last question is, what is the IEA's own assessment of the Glasgow Pact that was signed at the COP26?
So it's an excellent question. So we recognize that there are some elements that moved ahead more rapidly than others. Overall, as our executive director has said, we see many positive elements in what was agreed in COP26. Those elements, for example, on the level of ambition. I mean, it's true. It's particularly with the announcement that came from India. We did move forward in that element of strong climate ambition from key countries around the world. So now we have a situation where more than 90% of global GDP is covered by countries that have committed themselves to carbon neutrality, to net zero targets of different kinds. I mean, that's a very important step forward. There were also important supplementary agreements among countries in areas like the need to reduce methane emissions, which I think is another important area. There were important signs, I think, also of new collaborative structures that should help us move forward in future on things like low carbon technology deployment, the collaboration that was announced also between the US and China, the interesting announcement that was made about, just transitions for coal with South Africa. I think those are all positive elements that we can highlight. Naturally enough, elements of the rule book were also finalized. I mean, we recognize that may be quite technical. It probably didn't grab the headlines. But in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, those are all big steps forward. I think the area where we recognize there's still a lot to do is on climate finance, as well as areas like loss and damages and adaptation, where we think, there was some progress made, but I think everyone recognizes that there's still a lot more to do there. But on balance, we do see many positive elements coming out of Glasgow.
I know I said that was the last question, but I have just one more. India has been has received a fair amount of climate finance. Of course, the goal has not been met, and that is a huge disappointment. But India seems to be a little bit better off than other developing countries when it comes to receiving some of that climate finance. So in order for us to achieve these goals, these climate goals that we have announced, how much would we need? The Prime Minister has said that we need $1.3 trillion at least. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that figure?
So the amounts really depend on what you're trying to measure. Now, we do a lot of work on trying to quantify the investments that would be required in order to get us on track for net zero. And certainly when you look at a global level, the amount that's being spent on clean energy projects and related infrastructure, including electricity grids today, is around $1 trillion. Now that it's been quite stable in recent years. It was quite resilient in 2020. It's going to, in our view, rise, not hugely, but rise again in 2021. But that 1 trillion is well short of what we think would be needed in order to get us on track for a 1.5 degree stabilization. So already by the end of this decade, in our view, we would need to see more than triple that amount being spent on, not just on renewables, but on energy efficiency, on EVs, on new infrastructure that would allow us to move towards a low emission system. Now, public financing, a sort of international catalyst, is going to be very important there. But we do, for sums of that size, we're going to need to mobilize also a lot of private capital into energy projects. And I think that's an area where India has been successful in using the sort of catalytic potential of public money in order to bring in also private finance, mobilized often domestic private finance as well, which I think is a very important feature of the Indian market. So I absolutely recognize that those sums will need to increase. They will need to increase in India. They will need to increase in many other countries. We're very focused at the IEA on trying to think through what are the barriers to those kinds of investments? What are the barriers to those capital flows, both within a domestic system and internationally? How can we bring more capital into that clean energy transition? Because I think that's the defining challenge for the next few years.
All right. Thank you so much for your time and for speaking with us. It was a pleasure talking to you. For more videos like this one, please subscribe to The Print.